Namaste. Assalamu alaikum. Shalom. Ni hao. Buenos dias. Buenos tardes. Hesiche. Aquaba. Welcome. What up, though? This is Cafe Melange. Week 6. Session 4. La fin de la semaine. It's the end of the week for these joints. So we keep it light. I'm going to say this. There are over 118 million. 718 millones. Melange brethren. Around the earth. At least. Big ol'. So today, we are reading a story. And to be honest, I have yet to read the full story. I should say this. I've read the whole book like years ago. But it's been years since I've read it. And so I was planning to like go through some of these stories and do a little bit of what is it called? Vetting or whatever, screening before doing these joints. Yeah, we're doing this too. We're on this. Do a screening before reading it, but yo, who got time? So I did read a few pages of one story, and I said this seems decent. My concern is just to share something that I don't remember there being anything too scandalous or whatever, but I'm just trying to be mindful of that. So I don't want to be three quarters into the story and then be like, oh, yeah, no, we can't read this one. So, like I said, I think most of the stories are. I don't remember there being anything inappropriate or whatever, excessively. So, anyways, I read a couple pages of one story early this afternoon. It's difficult to see because that sound meter, it's windy today, and that sound meter goes back and forth with the wind, so it's difficult to see when I'm audible and otherwise. Oh, he's reading a book. So, anyways, I read a couple pages. It seemed like a nice story. I'm going to abstain from obstructing the auditory, the audio myself. But that ain't a guarantee about what other elements may do. So, this is the story. Human Mathematics by Mable Kabu. So, it's about, I think it's like 18 pages. It's 15 pages. So that'd probably be like maybe 20 minutes. Reading out loud. Probably actually 25, 30. We'll see how it goes. We're rolling. I'm going to read the bio. Mable Kabu is half Ghanaian and half German. She is just starting out as a writer and will have another short story, The End of Skill, published in the Anthology of New African Writers in 2006, in the Common Era, 2006. She grew up in Ghana but studied in the UK for 10 years. She currently lives in Accra, Ghana, and works as a research consultant in development issues. So here we go. Human mathematics. Folake's footwear were what made my first memory of her so vivid. She had not received her uniform, but she was already wearing the sensible footwear that would go with it. Hideous things that could only possibly have looked at home on the feet of a middle-aged filing clerk in the dusty, male-dominated offices of an accounting firm or insurance company. It was like meeting myself 2 years before. The footwear conformed perfectly to school regulations. Comfortable, low-heeled, black lace-ups, wide enough in front for each toe to wriggle around in perfect freedom without encumbering its neighbor. Broad, square heels, giving the feet giving the feet a solid, steady base. Generously cut uppers, lacing high, and providing excellent support. Yes, they were as sensible as footwear could be. It was as inevitable It was an inevitable irony that they would be sadly out of place amongst the actual footwear that Ridgefield girls wore. Footwear with flimsy heels, a few inches of toe lace, and above all, pointed winkle picker snouts that promised a future of corns and hammer toes. It was not only Falake's footwear, however, that conjured up my old self. It was her clothes, too. There was an awkward formality about them, at odds with her youth, which showed a compliance with regulations and a respect for authority at the expense of fashion and 15-year-old female frivolity. With my 2 years' experience, I knew that such deportment, even in a new girl, could elicit nothing but scorn and ridicule from most of her schoolmates. However, I recognized in her the fresh West African arrival I had once been. We might not be we might not be from the same country, but the air of respect and sobriety with which she presented herself was as familiar and intelligible to me as a common language, and from that perspective it was also completely appropriate. I knew instinctively that in her first weeks at Ridgefield, Falake would marvel at the tone in which some of her classmates addressed their teachers, thinking, I'd like to see her talk to a teacher in Nigeria like that. In my first term, I had often imagined transporting the further irritating amongst my classmates to my old school in Ghana, where you dared not address even the older pupils in such tones, and where bad behavior was punished not by order marks and detentions, but by stinging lashes administered by the sports teacher in the headmaster's office. The Falaki of a year later predictably wore different footwear and had stopped fantasizing about sending cheeky British schoolgirls to West Africa to learn the true meaning of discipline. Like me, she had learned to appreciate the intellectual pleasure of freer communication with one's teachers. However, coming from a society in which respect for seniority was deeply ingrained and rigorously enforced, she enjoyed this as a privilege, not a right, and thus never took advantage of it. The teachers and house staff appreciated this in her as they also had in me. Indeed, Falaki and I were often compared with each other because we had several things in common beyond our West African blood. There were other Nigerian girls in the school, but none were both in Falake's year and in her boarding house, as I was. There were also a few girls from other West African countries and a handful from Eastern and Southern Africa. In addition, there was a strong representation from Asia. In fact, although not officially international, Ridgefield had a strong foreign contingent. There were different degrees of foreignness, however. There were the fresh arrivals from abroad, and then there were the ones who looked foreign but had spent most, or all of their lives in England. The one other Ghanaian girl in the school, Stella Amisa Smith, fell into this latter category. She had been in the school since the earliest level and had spent all of her life in England. I had been quite excited to meet her at first, but somehow we had never formed a true friendship. My social circle was a veritable league of nations, whilst hers comprised almost exclusively British girls. The two circles simply did not intersect. Once we both understood that, we maintained a neutral distance from each other. In these divergent social constellations, there was another important difference between us, which incidentally also distinguished Falake from me. Strictly speaking, and certainly in biological terms, I was only half African. My other half was German, European, Caucasian, white. This distinction, which in purely racial terms might have bracketed Falake and Stella together and placed me outside their subset, did not in actuality constitute any common ground for the two of them. In fact, the distance between them was even greater than between Stella and me. On a line with three equidistant points, I would have been the midpoint with the two of them at either extreme. Midpoint was the natural position for me. The subtle complexities of this situation demonstrated the inefficiency of color as a lowest common denominator for human mathematics. Fortunately for me, I had recognized early in life that the ability of color labels to seem hopelessly superficial at best and ridiculously inaccurate at worst was, like the tip of the proverbial iceberg, the very indication that a dense hulking mass lurked beneath. Strangely enough, growing up in Ghana was a visibly brown child. As a visibly brown child, I had been labeled white, yet I had metamorphosed into a black for the first time I traveled to a white country. However, like the chameleon, another creature of distinct in-betweens, I had already learned that it was I who had to make the adjustment, not my surroundings. In my years at Richfield's Girls, the ease with which I moved between the colors of my spectrum was as involuntary as the changes in my accent. When I spoke to Falaki, her Nigerian accent teased out and propped up my languishing Ghanaian one. When I spoke to the teachers and the British girls, their clipped tones braced and nurtured by my burgeoning British accent. Some of my classmates had teased me about my Ghanaian English in my first year at school. What seemed to stand out was most what seemed to stand out most was intonation. This had caused some embarrassment in my first week when Sarah, a girl who sat next to me in class, had been unable to understand my request to borrow an eraser. The problem was that I pronounced the word with a heavy stress on the first rather than the second syllable. Sarah had obviously never been asked for an eraser before and wasn't sure what to make of my request. After a few efforts to make myself understood, I recognized we were drawing attention to ourselves and tried to put her off, but it was too late. "What's the matter over there?" asked the teacher. "Oh, nothing," we chorused. I was anxious for the fuss to die down, and Sarah was sensitive to that. But the teacher genuinely wanted to help because I was the new girl. "Did you need something, Claudia?" she persisted gently. "Well, I was just trying to borrow an eraser," I mumbled, hot with shame and cold with dread. "Oh, you mean an eraser," she said straight away. Apparently, it was not the first time she had heard it pronounced that way. Her correction had been completely involuntary and was not mocking or patronizing. I was grateful for that, but still had to endure the snickers of my classmates. Although embarrassing for me, the incident had been a genuine misunderstanding on Sarah's part. She was not one of the girls who had made fun of my accent. In fact, she later became one of my closest British friends. In my first year at Richfield, which I had entered at the third form level, we had sat next to each other in our classroom preceding assembly every AM, matin. In the fourth form, we were in the same dormitory together with four other girls. We were not close in the way best friends were, but we liked each other and had an easy familiarity that came from being thrown together in several settings within the school environment. She sometimes teased me with benevolent nature by calling me eraser. My interactions with her, as with the other white girls, generally featured the further Caucasian me. My Caucasian identity thus further in my life had consisted of looking different, being white in a black home country. Knowing European foods, having an ear for my Moore's favorite classical composers. It was being dropped at parties long before they began and collected before they ended because we were operating by European time in Africa. It was calling my grandparents, even the Ghanaian ones, Oma and Opa. Thus it was that I was further easily accepted, warmed up to by the white girls, safer territory for them than the pure African girls from Africa. The same situation pertained in reverse. In Falaki's first year at Ridgefield, I could sense that she was grateful to me for stopping at her downstairs dormitory on the way to breakfast. She had an amicable but still slightly stiff relationship with her dormitory mates and was further at ease with me. She probably sensed that she could be further herself in the few minutes of our walk than for the rest of the day. This was despite the presence of my best friend Mira. Perhaps Mira's being Indian and strongly accented made Folaki comfortable too. In the fifth form, we outgrew large dormitories and earned the privilege of double rooms. Although we were not given a choice of roommates, there was some effort to pair well-known sets of friends, and I was happy to discover that I was placed with Mira. Next door was Stella Amisa Smith and her best friend Jenny James. Those who were not part of an obvious friendship were randomly paired, and that was how Falaki and Sarah became roommates. There seemed no immediate problem with this pairing. The two had known each other for a year and had often been in my company at the same time in the common areas. However, we had not advanced very long into the term when undercurrents of tension began to hum. Although I had initially been pleased that I could see two friends at the same time, I quickly discovered that I did not feel comfortable when they were both present. For the first time, I became conscious of the switches in my accent. What was normally an automatic involuntary transition became a linguistic quandary. As often happens when switching rapidly between languages, elements from one linguistic set soon started to jump into the other like nerve impulses firing out of control. The result was not the smooth, natural blend of the two that I effortlessly utilized with Mira. It was a jarring, clumsy combination that made me feel awkward like a tuneful songbird that had unexpectedly produced a squawk. Under these tensions, conversations dwindled to pleasantries and flat jokes until I found myself looking for an exit. I started to question myself, my very being, and my own genuineness. I did not like feeling awkward and fake, and did not understand why I should feel that way in their room when I never did otherwise. Was it false and deceitful to be black with a black friend and white with a white one? And to be yet a third, perhaps brown, person with friends who were neither black nor white? Did it make me two or even three-faced? If it did, could I help it? For a while, I avoided Sarah and Falaki, trying to make the echoes go away. Deep down, I knew they were with me to stay, but at least I could quiet them by staying in as neutral territory as possible. In a school like Ridgefield, however, this was not easy, and my concerns returned with renewed vigor on the day of the row. The row. I was always grateful to have missed the main action of that fight. In theory, it had little to do with me anyway. Yinka and Allison were not even in my year. They were younger, and at that stage of our lives and in our highly structured school environment, a year's age difference was worth as much as a decade's in later life. However, both girls were in my house. It was natural for quarrels to break out once in a while in that populous, hormone-charged atmosphere that usually affected only the two girls involved and perhaps their closest friends. But this one was different. This one became a fight between black and white. One of the girls had been talking on the phone whilst the other was listening to a radio program. One had complained that the other was being too noisy, but neither was prepared to compromise. In the end, both radio and telephone were forgotten whilst they screamed at each other in the corridor. It was never firmly established which of them had first brought color into it, but the myriad versions of "you white girls don't respect anybody and go back to your country if you don't like the way we are" that later flew around the school clearly indicated the direction the quarrel had taken. What disturbed me most was the divisive aftermath of the conflict. There was a tacit need for everyone to take a stance. I feigned a senior's indifference to the immature carryings on of the juniors, but Mira was not fooled. How you doing, bro? All right. At lunchtime, Stella and Jenny joined our table. I longed to hear Stella's opinion on the topic, but did not want to ask her, so I almost dropped my fork when I heard Mira say in a bantering note, "Hey, so you two are flouting the new rule of segregation, are you?" "Nothing to do with me," said Stella with a dismissive shrug. "Pathetic," said Jenny as she passed the ketchup. "I wish they'd grow up." Stella squirted the ketchup all over her chips and dug into them with gusto. I could see that the topic had already vacated her mind, and I envied her detachment. I was quiet on the way back to classes, and when Mira said, "You don't have to take sides, you know, Claudia," I pretended to be brooding over my upcoming mathematics lesson. But Falake would not allow me to forget the incident. She knew Yinka and her family from Nigeria and was outraged on their behalf. "Do you know what that small girl said to her?" she fumed when she came to our room that evening. She told her that she couldn't even speak English properly and that she and her white friends imitated her accent and laughed. All right, how you doing, bro? All right. Buenos tardes. Imitated her accent and laughed. "Ah, how I wish I could take the lot of them to Nigeria just for one day. They would smell pepper." My African blood boiled up. "Couldn't speak English properly," I shouted. "Can she speak Yoruba?" Why didn't they ask her how many languages she can speak? Someone who can speak only one language insulting a person who can speak three or four. Chia! They feel They feel so superior, but they don't know that in Africa, even the children speak two or three languages. With every With every sentence, my voice grew louder, faster, and further Ghanaian. Mira shot me a look of mingled awe and amusement. As the conversation heated up, she kept up with us by waggling her head from side to side in that uniquely Indian way. That blend of a nod and a shake, which looks like no but means yes. Falake invited us back to her room to share some Nigerian food her aunt had brought on the weekend. Mira was tactful enough to know that Falake truly wanted to be alone with me, to bathe in the surging African tide. And indeed, it seemed like an appropriate moment to do such a thing, almost like drinking a toast to the renaissance of our African unity, our enlistment in the war against the insolence of spoiled white girls. I watched Falake mix the gari and water with that deft grace with which Africans handle food. I was already being transported back to Ghana, even before I caught the pungent mouth-watering aroma of the salt fish stew. She had warmed it on the little stove in the upstairs kitchen and beamed with pride as she brought it in. "It's my favorite," she said, spooning it over the moist mound of gari in the two plates. With eager anticipation, I watched the steaming orange rivulets of palm oil trickle over the white sides of the gari like lava from a volcano. We settled on her bed, plates in our laps, relishing the saltiness and the added pleasure that eating with one's fingers always seems to impart to a meal. Unique flavor of the palm oil.
I ain't gonna bother you.
All right, Leo.
I did want to tell you something, but that wasn't that important. I'll tell you another time.
Okay, cool. I'm glad. I appreciate that. The unique flavor of the palm oil. We settled on her bed, plates in our laps, relishing the saltiness and the added pleasure that eating with one's fingers always seems to impart to a meal. The unique flavor of the palm oil, the coarsely chopped slivers of onion, so characteristic of a West African stew, and the fiery tang of the chili peppers were like old friends found again. Tell your auntie I said her stew is too sweet. I sniffed, sinuses streaming and eyes watering from the pepper. Falake smiled at my African turn of phrase, understanding the compliment. She asked if my more ever prepared food like that. Not any further, I said. She made the effort when we were in Ghana, but as for the saltfish, I laughed and she nodded knowingly. Yes, the smell. As for that one, the Oyobos can't stand it. Aha. You know already how she hated it. She didn't want that fish in the house at all. I used to ask her how she could complain about it when she loved eating those moldy, stinky cheeses. Kai, I could never bring that stuff close to my mouth. Falake hardly agreed, and as we marveled over this gastronomic puzzle, the door opened and Sarah walked in. Astonishment registered on her face as she saw me seated cross-legged on Falake's bed, plate balanced in my lap, oily orange fingers halfway to my mouth. I could tell at once that the greatest shock had been to discover that the loud African voice chatting and laughing with Falake did not belong to one of her Nigerian friends, but to me. "Hi, Sarah," I said quickly and too brightly. "Hello, Claudia," she said in a voice which could easily have continued, "Pleased to meet you." The shock had been so great that she could not hide her discomfort. She had entered her own room to find herself in alien territory. "You're invited," I said, unable to think of anything else to say. "Invited," she echoed, shaking her head in irritated confusion. "Invited to what?" I pointed at the food. "No thanks," she said. She was polite enough not to put into her words what her eyes said, which was, "How can you eat something like that? How can you eat something that smells like that?" Instead, she said, "I was just coming to get my glasses." She grabbed them from her night table and, without further ado, fled the smell of saltfish and the two aliens sitting in the African den that had once been her room. There was an uncomfortable silence that Falake broke with. "My friend, as for this one, she no fit chopman. As for this one, she no fit chopam." "No, you're right, of course. She doesn't know how to eat it," I replied using a Ghanaian expression that had always infuriated my Moor. "What do you mean you don't know how to eat it?" she would say. "Just put it in your mouth, chew it, and swallow it." But Africans knew what it meant. Sarah could no further have eaten that food than performed a Yoruba dance on the spot. I giggled at the expression because the memory of my Moor's indignation always made it amusing to me. Falake giggled at her own utilization of broken English. Some tension was released, and I started to feel sorry for Sarah and a little disloyal. I hope we didn't offend her, I said. Ah. Why should she be offended? Asked Falake. We didn't do anything wrong. This is also my room. Yes, of course, I know, I said hastily, but I think we made her uncomfortable. She's such a nice girl, I added lamely. Well, you may find her nice, but you don't have to live with her. I just don't know why two people as nice as you and her can't get on, I said with some exasperation, finally giving voice and life to that delicate topic. Claudia, please, that girl looks down on me because I'm a Nigerian. She doesn't like my music because it's too noisy. She doesn't like the smell of my food. You know, you saw her just now, didn't you? Turning up her nose at it. She doesn't like my African friends coming to the room. She thinks she's better than me just because she's Oyabo. And she always wants the window open when it's freezing cold. I can't even feel comfortable in my own room because of her. Falake, Sarah is not like that. Honestly, she's not one of those girls who looks down on people just because they are black. I've known her longer than you, you know. I mean, she's always been perfectly nice to me. Yes, but you aren't truly black, are you? I mean, you can also be an Oyabo when you want to. She doesn't see you as a black. That's why she's so nice to you. As much as she's concerned, you're one of them. I was not happy with the turn the conversation was taking. I felt somehow offended without being sure exactly which part of what she had said had upset me. I was not even sure if the offensive part had been explicitly stated or implied, or, or whether it just hung there because the lines, between the lines, with or without the intent of the speaker. I also felt that familiar sense of unease that always pervaded me when the issue of taking sides of being one of them or one of us was so bluntly articulated. What I was sure about was that I was no longer comfortable in that room. I finished my food a little too quickly and told Falaki I was sleepy. She had already sensed that the mood was spoiled and did not make it any further awkward for me. That was one of the reasons I liked her. She was sensitive and intuitive. I knew I knew she would not have said what she had if I had not brought up a delicate topic. I had only myself to blame. After that incident, I renewed my resolve to stay in neutral territory. However, as if the cosmos itself had determined to make me face up to my own duality, things came to a head a mere fortnight later. It is amazing how an event of barely a minute's duration can generate hours, even days of discussion, then years of reflection. Yet a minute was probably all it took from the moment Sarah placed the waste paper bin on Falaki's bed until we burst into their room to find a handprint emblazoned on her cheek. 5 fingers, long and graceful, stamped beautifully in scarlet on a background white with chalk. I had always envied Falaki's elegant fingers. They were locked in a thrashing embrace, clawing, tearing, swaying dangerously. As Mira and I pried them apart, Stella and Jenny came running down the corridor from their room. What the? Oh my God, gasped Jenny. She hit me, Sarah screamed, as if it weren't evident. Falake stood there with a face like thunder, looking as if she would like to slap her again. I looked from one to the other, lost for words. Mira pulled Sarah away, sat her down on her own bed, and put her arms around her. Sarah collapsed into sobs, ruining the perfect contrast as the red of outrage and humiliation spread all over her face and neck. The doorway was crowded now, as further girls arrived to see what all the noise was about. In a flurry, Flolaki addressed us all as one. That B put the dustbin on my bed. Where Sarah's feelings seemed to be composed of equal parts anger, fear, and humiliation, Flolaki's consisted of pure, unadulterated rage. How dare you, she spat in Sarah's direction, making the word dare sound like an explosion. As all eyes turned to Sarah, she wailed, I didn't even recognize what I was doing. I was just trying to sweep the floor. Oh, please, snorted Falake. You knew exactly what you were doing. You wanted to insult me, to tell me I am no better than rubbish. The further impassioned she became, the further Nigerian she sounded. Recognizing the futility of talking to her, Sarah addressed herself to the rest of us. I always lift up the bin where I'm sweeping. Sometimes I put it on the table, sometimes on my own bed. It doesn't truly matter. I just wasn't thinking when I put it on her bed. I wasn't trying to insult her. I don't know why she has to be so touchy. and she started crying again. At that moment, the house mistress arrived at the scene. She took in Sarah's weeping distress and Falaki's icy fury in a glance. Aware that she might not obtain a clear picture of events from either of them, she allowed Jenny and Stella to acquaint her with the basic facts before ordering all of us back to our rooms. Before we left, I went up to each of them briefly. "Sorry, sweetheart," I said, patting Sarah's shoulder awkwardly. "You'll be fine. Can I get you anything in town?" It was harder to look at Falaki, her unrepentant rage further daunting to face than teary misery. So I just said, "Let's talk about it later, okay?" Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Stella watching me with an amused expression, and as we walked down the corridor, she said with a smirk, "Poor old Claudia, always trying to be everyone's friend." The sting of that well-timed remark lasted for years, but over time my resentment mellowed into something bordering on pity for her. After speaking to the two girls, the house mistress telephoned their homes and asked for them to be collected from school. They returned on Monday, Sarah with her Moor and Falaki with her aunt, who served as her guardian in England. After a long meeting in the headmistress's office, it was decided that Falaki, as the primary aggressor, should be suspended for the rest of the term. This would also neatly postpone the need to solve the accommodation problem for the two of them until the next term, since the Christmas holidays were a little further than a week away. It was not such a long sentence, however, it did mean that it was Falaki's last day of school until the new year. Sarah was punished with the detention for engaging in a fight. She was furious as she felt she had only been defending herself, but as she later recounted, the headmistress said she should have walked away and reported the situation immediately. Both girls were reminded in the Christmas terms that fighting was unseemly, unladylike, and utterly forbidden at Ridgefield. I had little chance to discuss events with Falaki before she left that day, or indeed to do much beyond saying bye and wishing her a Merry Christmas. Although I spent some time with her whilst she packed her things, we could not talk properly in front of her aunt. Only when her aunt carried the bags downstairs did she hug me. Perhaps she read in my eyes that I felt let down, that I wanted to ask her why she had done it, why she lived up to their stereotypes, for she said in a rush, "Claudia, I'm not usually a violent person, you know that. You know that. But she truly offended me, and it was the last straw. I can't put up with that sort of thing any further. I have my dignity, too. I know she's your friend, too, and I'm sorry you're caught in the middle, but it's okay. You don't have to take sides." Falaki was put in a different boarding house the following term. Several of her Nigerian friends were there, so she fit in easily and became even further a part of their set than she had been before. These changes, combined with our increased workload as we prepared for our examinations, facilitated a natural loosening of our relationship. Mira and I still chatted with her whenever we sat together in the dining hall, but things were never quite the same as they had been before the fight. 10 years after we left Richfield, I received a telephone call from Mira. "You'll never guess who called me this AM, this matin, Claudia." It was Falaki. She had stayed in touch with Mira longer than with me, but it was still at least 6 years since Mira had heard from her. She's married now, and guess what? She just had a baby, a boy. I was delighted and full of questions. Apparently, Falaki had married an Englishman whom she had met at university and was now settled in England for the long term. I could not imagine my old schoolmate as a married woman with a baby, a little mixed baby brown like me. "She wants to get back in touch with you, Claudia. I gave her your number. I knew it would be okay with you. It is, isn't it?" To my surprise, I felt tears in my eyes, and I think she heard them in my voice, although it was just for an instant. "Of course, Mira, of course it's okay." I told her we'd come and see the baby. Can you imagine seeing Falaki again? And we started reminiscing about her. We started reminiscing about her, what a character she was, the fun we had together, her irresistible the that we couldn't wait to hear again. As I giggled like a schoolgirl, I felt a slight lightening of a burden I had carried for years. "I can't wait, Mira. It'll be so great." She giggled in turn, rolling back 10 years with that girlish sound, and although we were on the phone, I could just see her waggling her head back from side to side. La fin. So there's a postlude. As a child, I found nothing strange about having one black parent and one white. It seemed as natural a divergence as the fact that one was male and the other female. Being yet another color myself seemed equally unremarkable. But definition comes from others, and it gradually seeped into my consciousness that I was assigned the identity of the parent who was foreign, the white one. Later, when I lived in Europe, I recognized that the same rule applied, and my racial identity reversed from white to black. Mastering the balancing act of contradictory racial identities in the knowledge that those imposing them are often unaware of their very existence is a demanding task in and of itself. Even further difficult, however, is the task of defining oneself. Human mathematics is the story of a mixed person forced into self-evaluation by simultaneous loyalties to friends who match her different racial sides. It is a reflective portion on a journey of self-analysis which I could not fully recognize or comprehend at the time I began it. During this journey, I was sometimes assailed by guilt and self-doubt, but I arrived finally at a secure acceptance of my racial identity for precisely what it is: mixed. Some rather formidable proclamations of mélanger in these books. The other one being "What Are You?" So that was about half an hour. Um, I like that story. Um, the beginning of it resonates with me particularly. Um, Obviously, we don't condone violence. Um, there's a little bit of a freeze. Okay, it's still going. Um, so having a different role, ethnic identity role, in each of those occasions. Uh, when I'm at Roughing, my small private school, growing up, ethnicity it was a comparatively Eurocentric environment, academically, but also collegially. There were a few people of other ethnicities, but it was predominantly European and upper middle class. So, uh, but I didn't experience a lot of racial or ethnic outright um, antagonism. I didn't receive antagonism pretty much at all. If anything, it was from the teachers uh, than anything else. And it was later. It was later in middle school, and there was racial things going on. But anyways, it was a different vibe. The point I was going to get to though is that um, I was there for 11 years. So by the time that type of stuff comes out, usually upper elementary school, middle school, I was already there for like 8 years. And so it's tough to like make fun of somebody in a small private school environment. They've been there for 8 years, and the school was just getting started. And so like I was cool with everybody in my year. So it's like there was some joking. Shalom, Brett. Haksamea.
Happy Sukkot.
Happy Sukkot to you as well. There were some joking from older students. Hi, but that's kind of ordinary. Um, and even then, it was um, very tame. So when I got to my high school, my prep school, um, it was a completely different scene. It was middle class or lower middle class thereabouts. It was increasingly hardcore, predominantly people of African ancestry. A different scene, and so I wasn't cool with any group. I was cool. I should say this. I was cool with every group, but I wasn't tight with any one group. And so I didn't get made fun of. I didn't get bullied too tough. I got into some tangles, but um, that's just part of things. Um, when I got to university, my undergrad, college, I went to an HBCU, a historically black college. 90%, 99% people of African ancestry, and there is colorism. But the thing is basically class in that joint, and also region, what city people come from. Uh, but again, and I pass for being black because there are a lot of mixed people at HBCUs. There's a huge spectrum of colors and degrees of mélanger at HBCUs, but it's very in my experience 20 years ago, is rarely discussed. Um, there's just an assumption of being African. That's the commonality, and so that's the norm. Um, but when I got to law school, well, before I got to law school, business school, that's where the difference comes. I was in business school. I did a study abroad in England, Manchester, um, and I connect with some HBCU brethren there, a brother and sister. So we were tough and we were tight, but we also like socialized with people from all over the earth. And at that point, it's like people are coming from literally coming from other nations, directly from other nations with that experience. And so ethnicity is less the thing. It's like what nation are you from? What language do you speak? Can we talk? And then let's play some football. um, so again, and at that age, I guess you're a little bit. It's a little bit older, and it's a little bit further mature. And it's like, where you plan to work? Are we competition? Can we support each other? This and the other. But we were just chilling. So it was a beautiful experience because I learned so much about other countries from that experience. But what I'm getting to is law school. Law school is where I probably had my second university, and obviously it's law school is it's different intensity of academic study, but it's 3 years, so it's almost the same duration of of undergrad, um, and so my involvement, my my devotion, my dedication to being there and being part of the university, being part of student organization. I wasn't student organization at business school because it's like, yo, we're just here for 2 years. I was just there for 1 year, so it's like, yo, in and out, got to get this done. But when I was in law school, okay, let's be part of this, the academic environment, the student environment. How you doing, bro? How was work today?
It wasn't too busy, but it was kind of, we had a couple pickups.
All right,
Slow down.
all right. You walking fast, so I can see you got energy.
I'm tired of rushing home to sit down.
All right, all right. So, but yeah, so in law school, I was like, yo, I'm gonna be here for a while. Let me invest in this. So I participate. And what's interesting is this. I was thinking about this actually in recent weeks. The Blue Jays are active at the moment. We are tough in autumn at this moment. This is what I was thinking about recently. Uh, when I was in law school, that's when I had my most the strongest experience of being multicultural, like intentionally multicultural. Because by that time, I was in tune and comfortable with my African identity. I had walked African soil, and so I was like, okay, cool, I've got this, and so I'm comfortable with this. But simultaneously, I love people from all. I walked in English soil and French soil, European soil, and so I had seen a fair amount of the earth modestly. I already built relationships, friendships with brethren from dozens and dozens of countries, probably over 100 or something. I think I put that on my resume, on my CV. So I was like multicultural. That's my thing. That's my homeostasis. That's my home base. So when I was in law school, it was just I didn't go out looking for it, but I would just it was there. And it was increasingly multicultural. The environment. It was obviously very Eurocentric, and that's the predominant ethnicity. But I don't know, even know if people maybe make about 50% thereabouts, maybe 60% of the student population. But there's a strong population of people from other ethnicities, and I hung out with them. So this is the interesting thing. First year, I had a crew. I was part of a crew, and that crew is very multicultural. And the majority of the people in that crew um, were I shouldn't say the majority, but a large number of them were people of African ancestry. So that was kind of like it wasn't necessarily. There's so many nuances. So Georgetown is an elite university. It's a Jesuit um, university, so it has that's like the foundation, and that's the norm. And the law school is elite. It's an elite institution, so it's most of the people are upper class, if and maybe upper middle class. If you're upper middle class, that's slumming it, quote unquote. I was middle class, but anyways, um, so it's an elite environment. It's an elitist environment, and so that's the backdrop. and in particularly law school. It's even further. It's advanced studies. So that being said, then in the section I'm in like the class that has classes together, it was kind of like a liberal program or like a liberal arts approach towards law school, and so it was increasingly it seemed to have an increasing number of people of different ethnicities in it that kind of like flocked to that kind of mentality or ideology, and that's what I was in. So that's like the social context that we have, and then so we form our friendships in that classroom, but also with classmates from, or schoolmates from other sections or other classes. So, anyways, they're like subsets. There's the university, there's the law school, there's the section, and then there's like the crew that we hang with. So the crew that I was tied with was very multicultural and very strong Afrocentricity. But even then, a strong African identity or black identity even is still within the context of being within an elitist environment and there being very strong pressures of assimilation. So it's kind of like a militant assimilationist kind of mentality or approach, which is it becomes increasingly apparent and increasingly like uh, called out as we graduate and make our decisions for what we're going to do for the rest of our lives in terms of occupation and employment. So, anyways, that's like the crew I hung with. Then there was like a further crew. That crew was like maybe a handful of people, maybe a dozen people or so. Then there was another crew that was larger, that was very multicultural, that was comparatively Eurocentric in orientation. It was very multicultural in terms of, or multi-ethnic in terms of like people from different ethnicities, but with a different mindset of kind of like a lily white a mindset of just like, oh, this, that, and the other is cool, da 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 da, and kind of like carefree, and not like that Afrocentric kind of multiculturalism. Of like, yo, let's do this, yo, let's get into that. Oh, when we gonna smoke out this, that, and well, actually, both groups smoked out, so that was a commonality. But it was just a different mentality, still both multicultural, and I was involved with both, but very different mentalities, and even interests, like even like music and culture and stuff like that. So it's very interesting to see that, and that progresses during the 3 years that I'm in law school, um, and as I progress in law school, um, uh, I become increasingly intentional in reaching out. I was already cool with people from all the different ethnic student organizations at the law center, um, but what I do further, particularly my second year, I worked at the international programs office, and so I got cool with all the international students, and there were over 100 international students. And I worked as a TA in the program and in the office as my work study after I did worked at the child care center. So I was cool with the international students, and that was another different vibe, another different culture. Again, of people coming from different um, societies and different cultures and languages. And so again, it's like, what language do you speak? Oh, okay. Can we be ourselves when we talk this, that, the other? Like she was talking about in the room, speaking, getting into the Nigerian culture. So that's what it was like with the flag, foreign lawyers at Georgetown. So. Um, uh, that's a different vibe. And we play footy again. Um, and it's a different culture. It's a different like mindset, a different scene. Actually, to be honest, it's increasingly bourgeoisie, which was interesting. And they don't drink the same things, don't smoke out, to my knowledge. And but like the wine, and I wasn't a wine drinker, so when it came like going to the parties, like I don't know what wine to bring. I don't drink wine, so I don't have to worry about that problem these days. But I remember what I found. I did like the ghetto move of like, yo, let me just bring a big jug. I'll at least bring a lot. And I knew better, yo. I knew about the right kind of liquor to bring to a joint. I knew like the nice liquor, but like I didn't know nice wine. But I knew enough to like don't get the big jug of wine. I knew enough to get not to get the box. But I was like, yo, it was a decision between the small thing and the big one. It was the same exact kind of wine, and I had heard of the label, but I didn't know anything about its reputation or anything like that. So, anyways, I could. It was left in the refrigerator throughout the joint. So, anyways, different scenes, but all multicultural, and that's what's interesting. A multicultural kind of joint. So, anyways, And there came a point where it was like, are you going to be with this group? Oh, are you going to be with this group? Are you going to be with that group? And I could feel myself kind of like becoming increasingly distant from all the different groups because I would go to the parties and do the things, but like the small things of just like stopping by somebody's house and just stopping by the afternoon and chopping it up, or doing the small things. And additionally, um, regular phone calls just to see how you're doing. I mean, we don't do too much of that in law school, anyways, but at all. But it's like as the years were progressing in law school, I could feel myself like, and people would reach out to me and invite me to something, be like, "Yo, I can't do that today. I got something else going on with this and the other." I could feel myself distancing from each of the groups. Still cool, still reaching out to each other, but distancing, and recognizing that like I'm cool with each one, but I don't like neither none of them is like categorically like my joint. And I could start seeing myself after graduation, like, yo, like I can see the people in that group keeping in touch after school, and when Facebook comes out a number of years later, indeed I do see the reunion gatherings, the private reunion gathering photographs on Facebook posts. But it's like, anyways, I long to have that multicultural group that was like my clique. Um, Still working for that. All these years and decades later. Um, but what I observe is how, even in the different groups that are multicultural, many of the people revert back to their own ethnic communities after graduation when it comes down to settling, getting married, getting a job, going to a religious congregation or house of worship. It becomes there's a certain like regression back into like ethnic specificity, and the multicultural friends are kind of like the eccentricity that the ethnic community tolerates amongst the multiculturally inclined on special occasions. Oh, this is who is that at the wedding, or who is that at this, that, and the other? Oh, that's a friend from such and such. Oh, where does they work? What can they do for us? Um, so that's what I observe. That's what I experience, and it's interesting to see that here. To just the her name escapes me at the moment. Mamle, Mamle Kabu. Went to hear Mamle, or to read and listen to, as I listen to myself, Mamle Kabu's story of being in school and what the experience is like. I think she does a nice job of depicting the experience of being in the in between, the conflict, the inner conflict, the personal conflict, but then also like that conflict coming to a head. Um, and so it seems to be autobiographical, and like a like those events actually happen in some way similar to what she describes. So there's a certain amount of authenticity that resonates from that, and uh, I apply that experience to each of the contexts of my schooling career, the different environments and the different settings. Um, and I think it's interesting to consider how class plays into that factor. Like I said, the upper class, the upper middle class, where assimilation is presumed, even amongst those who are homogeneously of a different ethnicity, they're still like, oh, but they're going to get a job, or they're going to look for employment with the mainstream, and so uh, the getting along is along those lines, compared to like a middle class or even a working class. So. Uh, and then so that's one consideration, and then also the different types of ethnically anchored multiculturalism, whether it's an Afrocentric multiculturalism and a Eurocentric multiculturalism, and a Desi-centric multiculturalism, an Asian anchored multiculturalism, um, how that factors into it, how the principles and the norms of the pervading ethnic community influence the relationships and the approach of the people of other ethnicities within that environment. Like Mamle Kabu describes her Ghanaian background, where people there's a certain Eurocentricity within the circles that she was experiencing beforehand, where her mixedness, her mélange, fit within that context, and that being different than her context. Actually, that's a little different from what she was describing. She was describing Afrocentric, where she was the white one in that environment, but still there being an element of well, I'm doing some presumption and maybe reading between the lines on that, but I'll leave it alone. Um, but her experience being different in Ghana than it was in England, um, and so it would be interesting to hear about like an international school in Japan, what the multicultural experience is at an international school. How Eurocentric is it? How Japanese is it? Um, uh, what are the experience of other people from like India or Africa or Latin countries, Latino countries, in a Japanese Japanese international school that is comparatively Eurocentric based. Um, in Latin countries, what's the experience of foreigners and ethnic people in Brazil, in Liberdade, in Buenos Aires, that has the second largest population of Koreans outside of Seoul, in Mexico, Guadalajara, Ciudad de Mexico, and additionally, even in Los Angeles, the land of the Mayans and the Paiute and the Guarani, reverse in reverse respective order. Guarani, Brazil, Mayan, Mexico, and Paiute, California. Um, so that would be interesting. It would be interesting to hear convos about what being mixed is like, mélanger in just SoCal and NorCal, and the different scenes in the 626, and in the different suburban municipalities, and additionally, uh, places where there's a predominant Asian population, places where there's a predominant Latino population, places where there's a predominant African population, places where there's a predominant European population. And then let's talk about the res, and let's talk about like NorCal, and it would be interesting to hear Audio Pharmacy's story of multiculturalism. Audio Pharmacy is a native hip hop band based in NorCal, that is conscientious, that spits some conscious lyrics, but and that has an entourage, and that works with a lot of different artists and is intrinsically multicultural. However, distinctly native and speaks to that. And so, there's so much ways of being multicultural, and so many different ways Mélanger feeds that and feeds from that. So those are some of the considerations. I'm gonna leave it at that. Oh, no join on Monday, no session uno next week. So, namaste, assalamu alaikum, shalom, zaijian, adios, te chakuri, se sempre na samudo, que le Fred, love and peace.